You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest today is Margaret Samdahl, and Margaret is a librarian from Virginia, and she is also the author of the book My Colt, The Story of Traveler, which is a children's book and a biography, not of General Robert E. Lee, but of his horse Traveler. Welcome to the show, Miss Margaret.
Thank you so much. I'd like to say technically my husband was a librarian. I was actually a chemistry major and came upon the story of Traveler when I started to work at Lee Chapel.
Your job at Lee Chapel then, were you more of a curator then than a librarian?
People associated me as a librarian with Lee Chapel because when I started working there in 2005, and there was just a few books. There were a few books on Robert E. Lee there. And what happened was a friend of mine said, there are all sorts of books on Robert E. Lee, and there's a whole industry in the antiquarian ones. So when I became co-manager of the Lee Chapel Museum, my husband is a librarian, and I love to read, and I love history, and I started buying books wherever I could find them on Robert E. Lee and George Washington, because we're Lee Chapel, a lot of people don't realize, but it's part of Washington and Lee University. It kind of grew from there, and so I then started becoming known as kind of the librarian or the book lady, and people would see me around Lexington with my little, it was actually a suitcase dolly, but I filled it with books, with boxes of books, and I would be trotting all around Lexington on my way to Lee Chapel with all the books that I had. And people even would come in. It was really amazing because I had one couple come in, and they saw the 4-volume Robert E. Lee set by Douglas Southall Freeman for sale, and they went, whoa, this is a way we could support Lee Chapel. We have 2 sets of this Pulitzer Prize-winning series by Douglas Southall Freeman. We would be happy to donate it to the shop for you to sell and the money to support Lee Chapel. So it just started growing and growing. And while I was co-manager, people would come in and they would see Richard Adams' big book on Traveler. And it was Traveler telling his story, kind of like people say, oh, like Mr. Ed. Well, yes, it was an early version of Mr. Ed, the TV talking horse show. And Richard Adams, who wrote Watership Down, most people have heard of that book, but many of them are not aware that he did the same thing. He had Traveler tell his story. But it's a big book. It's, I think, maybe 200 pages. People would look at that and they'd tell me, they'd say, why is there not a children's book on Traveler? And that's when, in 2005, the idea started kind of twirling around in my brain. This is something we need to do.
What year did you actually publish the My Colt book?
It actually was just done this last year.
Okay, that's what I thought. I thought it was a newer book.
It's almost brand new. It came out in 2018, and somebody asked me, they said, Margaret, why did it take you so long? Like I said, my first degree is in chemistry and then medical technology and nursing, and I have a master's in management in nursing. So my point is my background was not in English or writing, but I've always, since a child, loved history and loved horses. I kept getting encouragements. People would come in and they would tell me, we need this book. You know we need a children's book, so why don't you sit down and read it? And write it. And I said, oh, I'm not a writer. And one lady from out in the Midwest, she came in and she said, Margaret, you can do this. Her name was Winnie Schaefer. She was one of the many that told me, she said, just start taking the notes. You've got all the information. Traveler is buried right outside Lee Chapel. A lot of people don't realize that either. And for many years, he was on his bones, if you can imagine. His bones were on display in Lee Chapel. Folklore has it that the Washington and Lee students would come, and for good luck on their exams, they'd carve their initials in Traveler's skeleton. And I even had one lady come in and tell me, she said, oh, where's Traveler's skeleton? And I said, well, it deteriorated. It kind of got, abused a little bit, I think, with all the writing, and then it just started to deteriorate. And this lady said, oh, I really wanted to see it because my grandmother wrote her initials on the skeleton. And I thought, well, it wasn't just the students. This just seemed to be kind of graffiti in a different form. And so what happened was Traveler, he was sent, the skeleton was sent to, I think it was up to New York, Rochester, New York, for preservation. And he came back, and his remains were mounted and put in a glass case to protect it. But then, I think it was like 1929, finally, he was returned. But then, when he was in such bad condition that they finally took the bones and put them in a box. And it was not until 1971 that he was buried outside the chapel, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy were there for the Virginia branch, and they were the ones that donated the headstone marker for his gravesite, which is right outside the museum doors.
So Lee was buried inside the chapel, correct?
Yes, exactly. Robert E. Lee and his family are all buried in the Lee Crypt, which is on the lower level, the museum level of Lee Chapel, and then you walk out these glass doors, and as soon as you walk out, there's Traveler's gravesite. So you have, even in death, I'd like to tell people when I work there, I'm now retired, but I'd say even in death, the horse and his owner were basically side by side, just as they were on the battlefield when Robert E. Lee, as most people know, did not stay in people's homes very often. He usually just camped out in his tent, and he and Traveler were right there together. And when Robert E. Lee became president of what was Washington and Lee at that time was called Washington College, he even said when they built the president's home, he made this little, it's like a breezeway to the stable, and he said, oh, now Traveler and I are living under the same roof. And so Traveler was right there. Ever since Robert E. Lee purchased him during the Civil War, they were together. I don't think they were ever separated. So it's a really kind of a unique story of a horse surviving all those years of the war, and then after that coming with Lee to Lexington.
Do you know offhand exactly how far into the war it was that Lee had purchased Traveler?
Yeah, I do, and that's another story. I have so many little, as my husband would say, little rabbit trails to go down on this. One of the things that happened was, so in 2005, I came to Lee Chapel, and the young lady that was in charge of the shop, she left for another shop, and I think in Roanoke, Virginia. So I became the interim head of the museum shop at Lee Chapel. Then another lady, Gloria Gorlin, and I became co-managers of the shop, and that's when I became the specialist in the books, and Gloria did a lot of the paintings and things like that for the museum shop. So what happened was that in 2008, a direct descendant of Thomas Brown came into Lee Chapel. And when she came down to the museum shop, we started talking. Most people don't realize that Traveler was born in what was then Virginia. It's now West Virginia, but Greenbrier County on a Mr. Andrew Johnston's farm. And the Johnstons then were the ones that had Traveler, and he was seen by Robert E. Lee in the Sewell Mountain when Lee was in the very western part of the state. It was not, and he expressed great interest in the horse, but it was not until the next year, the winter of 1862, that Traveler, who was named Jeff Davis, saw him in South Carolina with his owner, and this was one of the Brown brothers. It was Thomas and Joseph Brown that had purchased Traveler from Mr. Johnston in Greenbrier County, now West Virginia. So Lee had admired Traveler, who was named, his birth name was Jeff Davis, and he saw him, and then he was sold by Mr. Brown in the winter of 1862 in South Carolina. I have a letter. I don't know if you'd be interested in hearing it, but what happened was, back to 2008, this lady named Isabel Hogg from Indiana. She is a direct descendant of Thomas Brown, who was the second owner of Traveler. And we started talking, and she said, "Oh, Margaret, I have a picture of Traveler with my ancestor Thomas Brown writing." And she said, "I think this would be great to donate, to give as a gift to Lee Chapel for the museum." And I said, "Oh, I would love to see that." And so months later, I received this email from her just out of the blue, and she said, "Margaret, I know you've just given up hope of ever hearing from me, but I've been busy, but I want to send this card with the picture of Traveler, and on the back this inscription." And I said, "Well, that's wonderful." So then it was still another month or two after that. I think it was close to Christmas. Here comes this package to me, and I just put it in my bag and took it home to open later. And the university went on, I think it went on Christmas break, is how, it's so long ago, my memory. And when I opened it up at home, I told my husband, I said, "Oh my goodness, I cannot believe this." And here was this beautiful picture of Traveler. I guess it's a famous painting of him. And underneath it, it has written in Mr. Thomas Brown's handwriting, "General Robert E. Lee on Traveler," with the generals, and he lists them. And on the next page, he says, "A correct likeness of Traveler as he appeared when General Robert E. Lee purchased him of me during the war. See my communications to Richmond Dispatch of August 10th, 1886. Also see Fitzhugh Lee's Life of Robert E. Lee, page 312. Also see Confederate Veteran, July 1898, Thomas L. Brown, October 8th. It looks like it's, I think it's 1898. It's a little bit hard to read. So this came to me, and I thought, oh, wow, this is just another encouragement that I've got to get this book written. So I started, they made copies of this. I gave it, of course, to the university, and they made copies of the painting. And it's an interesting one because Traveler looks quite elegant, and Robert E. Lee is in the foreground riding him, and he has kind of a top hat look. You know, all the generals have these formal-looking top hats on. So it's a pretty famous painting. I think in Richmond, the former Museum of the Confederacy, they have a new name now. I think it's the American Civil War Museum. I think they own the original paintings. But that was evidently, this was like a postcard that came with this picture on it, and then on the back he wrote this, and she had inherited it, and she sent it to me for the museum. She said that Thomas Lee Brown was was related to her through her maternal grandfather, and that she had inherited this and had all the rights to give it as a gift to the university. And then the other thing, tell me if you want me to stop, because
Actually, I will ask you to pause here so that we can have a brief word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review. As soon as this little commercial is over, we'll be right back with our guest, Margaret Samdahl. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. And we're back back. So, Margaret, go ahead and pick right up there where we left off.
And so I started taking notes on Traveler. Every time anybody would come in with little interesting tidbits on Traveler, I'd write it down, and I started then, like with Isabel Hogg's ancestor, Mr. Thomas Brown. I went back and I found the Confederate veteran article that he wrote, and it tells all about, it says, when General Lee took command of the Wise Legion and Floyd Brigade, which were encamped at and near Big Sewell Mountains in the fall of 1861. He saw this horse, this named Jeff Davis, and took great fancy to it. He called it his colt and said he would need it before the war was over. So that was when Lee, according to the Browns, first saw Traveler. Now, I have some notes that are from the 1900s that one lady said, oh, no, General Lee, when he came to that area, to Sewell Mountain and early in 1861, that he saw Traveler at Mr. Johnston's farm in a paddock and said, oh, I would like that horse. And the Johnston said, no, we've already told the Brown brothers that they can own him. So there are all these different little stories that it was very hard to tell which is folklore, which is the truth. But what I came upon, which to me, when I was doing my research, was Isabel Hogg's, her descendant, the Browns, the other brother. There was the two Browns. It was Thomas Brown and his brother Joseph that bought Traveler. So what happened, I was in Special Collections, which is the archives at Washington and Lee University, and they're so helpful there. They really are wonderful with research. And I told Lisa McCowan in Special Collections, I'm trying to do my children's book on Traveler. And she's an animal lover and said, oh, this is great. Let me see what I can find. What she pulled out of her file was a 1904 typewritten letter from Joseph Brown to his niece, Martha Orway, who lived in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And it's a typed letter. So I went on the computer today, and I thought, I just want to double check on this. And it says the typewriter was invented in 1878 by Americans in Wisconsin, because the head, Tom Camden, is head of Special Collections, and he looked at this with me, and he said, well, I don't know. This is what this letter had been given to Special Collections. He said, I don't know if it was handwritten to begin with, or if then typed, or if it was typed to begin with. So we don't know that. But what it was, this to me was just a gold mine, because this is the man who directly sold the horse to Robert E. Lee, the horse that became named by Traveler by Robert E. Lee. And it's a very lengthy letter, but I'm happy to read part of it if you'd like to hear some of it.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, this was, to me, just gave me so much, I felt, of the true essence of the relationship of Robert E. Lee to this horse. And so Mr. Joseph Brown wrote, My dear Martha, you asked me to give you some facts about General Robert E. Lee's noted war horse Traveler, as he wrote the name. The horse was a steel gray gelding, nearly 16 hands high, having a perfect form, great strength and durability, and noble carriage, moving gracefully and rapidly with ease to himself and his rider. Traveler was known and admired by all of Lee's army. The general was a splendid rider, a handsome man, more impressive as our commander when mounted, especially on Traveler. This, his favorite horse, faithfully served General Lee to the close of the war and was taken to Lexington, Virginia, and used by the general while president of Washington and Lee University until his death as the saddle horse. The horse died afterwards of lockjaw caused by treading upon a nail which pierced his foot. He was about 6 years old when General Lee bought him from me in January or February 1862. The horse was bred in Greenbrier County, Virginia, now West Virginia, near the Blue Sulphur Springs, by the father of Captain James W. Johnston. The captain still survives, and this was in 1904. The captain still survives, a prosperous, influential citizen residing in his native Greenbrier County, which is noted for its well-bred horses, its bluegrass, its white sulphur, and other springs. And he says this colt, when Mr. Johnson Sr. owned him before the war, was known as Jeff Davis and took first prize premiums at the county fair as a 2- and 3-year-old. In the fall of 1861, General Robert E. Lee, with the brigades of General Floyd and Wise and others, were camped on Sewell Mountain in Fayette County, West Virginia. I had been commissioned captain and assistant quartermaster. James W. Johnston, as mentioned, then a private, was acting as my quartermaster sergeant. We belonged, Johnston and I, to the 60th Virginia Regiment of Infantry, previously called the 3rd Regiment of Wisely. Johnston, a forager, went to his father's home and returned with several wagon loads of corn and riding his colt, Jeff, afterwards known as Traveler. He sold Jeff to me for $175 sometime in October of 1861 and delivered possession with the understanding that I would pay him therefor, which I did about December 7th, 1861, as soon as I drew my pay in Virginia banknotes. And there's he also writes about meeting Traveler, meeting Robert E. Lee. Do you want to hear that part?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, this is what I especially used in my children's book. He says, I well remember the first time General Lee summoned me to his presence. It was a raw, wet morning in November 1861. I've heard since then from the historians it was earlier. It was October, probably. That by November they were gone. But this was written in 1904, so memory kind of fades. But he continues. General Lee and staff were standing by a fire in front of his tent on the north side of the road. A dead mule lay stretched across the road just opposite this group. I, mounted on Jeff, was riding briskly to my regiment and must pass this mule, obstructing my way upon the very eye of my general. What shall I do? What would Jeff do? Without halting or breaking his gait or upsetting me, upon my touching Jeff, he gracefully leaped over the mule and moved on without fear. Upon reaching my regiment, Captain Glover of General Lee's staff soon appeared, stating that the general desired me and my horse forthwith at his tent. I was somewhat startled at this invitation and urged Glover to explain, but he did not know or would not tell. He and I had been fellow students at college. And so that's when General Lee called Joseph Brown in and compliments Traveler and says, oh, where did you get such a beautiful, fearless, and useful animal? I want one just like it, and I must have one. But Joseph Brown said, I was tempted then to offer Jeff to him, but concluded that such would be bold and uncoming. In December 1861, they went to South Carolina, and then it was in the winter of 1862 when he was riding Jeff that he saw Robert E. Lee, and he at once recognized me. Probably my horse more impressed him. He spoke to me, calling me Captain Brown, congratulated me upon the safe arrival of his Virginia regiment, and was glad I had brought his colt along. And so upon returning to the camp, I left the horse at General Lee's stable and let him know the horse was at his service so long as he saw fit to keep him. So this is when it's back at Sewell Mountain that Robert E. Lee first saw Jeff Davis, the horse, and fell in love with him, and then purchased him a few months later in 1862.
Do you know the reason why the name was changed from Jefferson Davis to Traveler?
It's my understanding that Mrs. Robert E. Lee, was a descendant, a great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, and Robert E. Lee really admired George Washington. It is said that one of George Washington's horses was named Traveler. I have really not been able to confirm that, although I've been told by people who have done research on Washington's horses that they think that's true. The other thing I found in one of the articles that was written that it was considered back then good luck to change the name of a horse when it became yours. You know, when it changed owners, it often changed names. There's also some articles say that the Johnstons, which this makes no sense to me because the owner, Andrew Johnston, named the horse Jeff Davis. And that was when Jefferson Davis was Secretary of State of the United States. Most people don't realize that Jefferson Davis was he was not Secretary of State, he was Secretary of War. And he was evidently greatly admired by the Johnstons, and they named their horse Jeff Davis after him. Now, what I've also read is that Traveler's birth name was Jeff Davis. This is documented in history. Then there are articles that say that Mr. Johnston's son named Traveler Greenbrier after the county that he was born in. There's nothing in the Brown's correspondence that I've been able to find that says that. Mr. Brown says that in his letter that he sold Jeff to Robert E. Lee. So it's possible that Traveler was Jeff Davis, Greenbrier, and then Traveler. And some people say it's after George Washington's horse. Others just say that Robert E. Lee said that he and Traveler were going to travel a lot together. And he, when Robert E. Lee would write Traveler's name, it was the English version with 2 L's. And that's another thing. You see it spelled with 1 L, but Robert E. Lee spelled Traveler's name with 2 L's.
Tell us a little bit about the book itself. Tell us, I'm not expecting you necessarily to read the book, but kind of give us the synopsis of the book.
Well, what I did was I took, because Robert E. Lee, when he first saw Traveler in the western part of Virginia back in 1861, he called him, even back then, my Colt, is what the soldiers would write in the story of him meeting Traveler. So I thought, my artist actually, Carol Blair, she told me, she said, let's name the book My Colt. So we did My Colt, the story of Traveler. And we wanted it to be for children that are just starting to read. And when I was at Special Collections at Washington and Lee, I asked Lisa McCowan, because she's an animal lover, I said, do you know anyone that could illustrate my book? And she said, oh, yeah, the librarian that's just right down the hall, Carol Blair, she's an animal portrait specialist. And so I talked to Carol, and she sent me her portfolio, and I went, oh, this is exactly what I want. I wanted realistic, natural-looking pictures, because so many of the children's books now, the pictures are like caricatures. I wanted really beautiful color pictures for my little book.
So you didn't want Traveler to look like the donkey from Shrek?
Exactly. You know, I love the donkey from Shrek, but, you know, I wanted Traveler to look like Traveler.
Well, Margaret, let's go ahead and pause here, and once again, we'll have a commercial, this time from our sponsor, the American Free Press newspaper.
Extra, read all about it!
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. There's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money-controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
All right, we're back again. And so, Margaret, why don't you go ahead and finish that thought that you had about how you wanted the portrayal of Traveler in your book to be illustrated realistically and not cartoonishly, as you see in a lot of children's books these days.
And what I really had, as a horse-loving child, I had always enjoyed Marguerite Henry's books. And she wrote Album of Horses and Misty of Chincoteague and all these just fabulous books. And she had Wesley Dennis illustrate her books. And if you look at her books, it's not a lot of text. At least the children's books are that I had were not a whole lot of text, but on the opposite page is a gorgeous color picture. And so my husband said, "Margaret, it's like the taxi with the meter running." He said, "This is really quite an undertaking to get this done." And I said, "Well, no, I think it'll be okay because the book's not going to be that big. In fact, I've got a copy right here, and let's see, it's only 39 pages." And so what I did, because Carol went, "Whoa, that's a lot of paintings." So some of them we have black and white little kind of, I guess that's pen and ink. I'm not an artist, but she did those. So how I designed it was for Traveler. First of all, I tried writing it where Traveler's not telling the story. And I sent it to Jessica Bowers, who's one of the new young women. She's a young woman in charge of the Lee Chapel Museum, one of the co-managers. And she said, "Margaret, thank you for your manuscript. This would be great if you were in college doing a research paper." But she has 2 children in elementary school. She said they really enjoyed the story, but they want it to be a story. And I said, "Well, Richard Adams did Traveler, the talking horse. I didn't want to copy him." She said, "This is a whole different thing. Richard Adams wrote his book in the 1980s. And she said, "This is now. This is a lot of years later, and it's for a much younger audience. This will be a young children's book." And I went, "I can do it." So I sat down and took all my notes and completely rewrote it so that Traveler's telling his story. So how it is, it's called, the title page has My Colt, The Story of Traveler, Robert E. Lee's Famous War Horse by Margaret Samdahl, illustrated by Carol Blair. And then it opens up, and you would see it has one of Carol's. Also, it's the picture on the cover, but the first chapter has the beautiful picture of Traveler as a foal with the mountains. I told Carol I want the misty mountains that are in the West Virginia and the western part of Virginia. I want those in the background because they really think Traveler was so strong. Not only because of the bluegrass there, but because he was on the mountains. So he was already very, very strong. And his father, they think, was Gray Eagle, a famous thoroughbred, and his mother, Flora, was what they called a grade mare that they think maybe was a Kentucky pacer. But with his breeding, he had a lot of energy and fire. But he also was born in the mountains and was just already came as a war horse very strong. So on the first chapter, I have at the top, I tried to do it so that the children would kind of get some history too. It has growing up on the farm, Greenbrier County, 1857. 2 things you should know about me from the beginning. The first is my name was not always Traveler. The second is I did not know I would grow up to become a famous war horse. So we take it from there, and my husband formatted the book for me. He was just fabulous. And what he did, he took Carol's color paintings, and then on the text part, which is across the page from the illustration, he took it and made it like into a little icon. I told him, I said, think of an illustrated manuscript in medieval ages where they had the little icon. And so he took that, and so each of the chapters have these beautiful little icons starting with it. And Carol really, really did just a fabulous job of capturing what to me looks like Traveler's expression. He looks alert, but he looks sweet. And one of the things I saw, both the Johnstons and the Browns talk about how Traveler liked to be patted. And I just wanted Traveler's personality from reading all these research papers and letters and everything. I just began to get this picture in my mind of Traveler. And Robert E. Lee, how much he loved this horse. And, I mean, immediately calling him My Colt. And just wanting to be, when he built the Lee House, like I said, to be under the same roof. And they even say when Robert E. Lee was president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee, when he was president, that he would take time from his duties from the college and walk Traveler down to the blacksmith and hold him and talk to Traveler while the blacksmith would shoe Traveler. And he would tell him, Traveler had all those, adventures during the war, and it made him kind of skittish to have all those bullets and loud noises and bombs going on over his head on the battlefield. So be patient with him, and I'm going to stay right here. And he evidently stayed with Traveler the whole time he was shot. How many little stories do you have like that of people with their horse that in history? I feel very fortunate and blessed that I came upon all these, and my book has been fairly successful here too. Not a lot of people are interested in history anymore, and I really wanted this book to be like a stepping stone for children to find more. And that was one of my hopes, was that this would interest a child not only in the horse but in history.
Of course, you had worked for a number of years there at Washington and Lee University, and
Right.
Carol Blair, the illustrator, was a librarian there at the university. The University Archive Department had helped you, put the book together and so forth. And so
That's right.
This was very much a collaborative effort of several members of the university staff. But yet you had told me that originally the university did not want to allow the book to be sold on campus.
Well, what happened was, yes, and Carol Blair has been at the university, I think, 35 years. She is a little bit younger than I am, and she's not retired. I'm retired, but she is still at the library at Washington and Lee. And yes, it was a great Washington and Lee staff effort with all the help I had from special collections and all the encouragement from the new co-managers, Byron Fadley and Jessica Bowers at Lee Chapel, and Lucy Wilkins, the manager. So everybody was so encouraging to me, the Lee Chapel staff, everybody. And what happened was when the book was published, I took it over to Washington and Lee, and they had no trouble with it. Lee Chapel Museum Shop, of course, carried it, and up at the great big university store at Washington and Lee, they carried it to support one of their, colleagues and a new book. So the book was on the shelf and for sale and selling well. And evidently, a professor came into the Lee Chapel shop. She saw that it was advertised in the campus notices at Washington and Lee, and she said, I want to see the new book on Traveler. And they showed it to her, and we're very proud to show it to her, and she went, no, I don't like this book. And she wrote the president of the university and some others and said, I don't like this book. I really don't want it carried. And I was just absolutely astonished. They pulled it from the shelves. And I received a phone call one afternoon saying, we are not able to sell your book. It has been pulled from both the university store and the Lee Chapel Museum shop. And I told my husband, I said, this is really crazy. My story is all historical. It was all researched with the W&L Library, with their archives, and with where Traveler was born, the museum there. I had all sorts of papers, articles from, the Civil War period and past. So I said, this is not new information. Why would they pull my book and not say anything about? There was, of course, Richard Adams' beautiful book on Traveler. It had been sold for years and years. Robert Pendleton, who I'm not sure if he's still in Florida, but when his book on Traveler came out, he was living in Florida, and he and his mother came to Washington and Lee, and I looked at his book, and I said, I was in charge of books at Lee Chapel, and I said, oh, yes, we would love to have this. Traveler is buried right outside the chapel. This is the perfect place. And his book is not a story. It's a factual book on Traveler, and it was a great resource for me, too. So I just was so astonished. I thought, why my little 39-page children's book? Why is it being pulled? So it was, it was first accepted, and then I was told, no, it was not, it was pulled, and I asked why, and then it was like, I don't really remember the timeline now, because this was early last spring, but I was told, well, it's self-published, so it hadn't had a peer review. Well, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I bought and sold books as the co-manager of Lee Chapel Museum for years and years and years, and no one ever said anything about any of the self-published books having to be peer-reviewed. It was just crazy. So eventually, and I really credit the News Gazette, which is our local newspaper, there was a big outcry that my book had been pulled, and they were about to publish all this. And they did do an article on Traveler, but I really credit the pressure from that the university said, well, we've sent it through all the review process, and it passed under our present, protocol and specifications that they couldn't say for the future, but for now, Traveler, My Colt, my little book, could be back on their shelves. The university store had sold out my book, and they never, even though I did write them, they have never reordered. But Lee Chapel does carry it. Virginia Military Institute carries it. Stratford Hall carries it. There's a local bookstore right there on Washington. It's on Nelson Street in Lexington, the Bookery. They carry it. Carol Blair's beautiful paintings are carried at another little small local bookstore, Books and Company in Lexington. And also, it's on Amazon. So, and then the hardback was originally on Blurb, but we primarily sell from the sites that I just referenced. So I have to say that I've never, I think in all my years, and I'm not young, I have never been so astonished by anything as I was that happening at Washington and Lee.
Well, we'll get back to that in a second. But the North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. Since you mentioned Amazon, I'm on the Amazon page now and I'm looking, and it shows 14 copies of your book are available. So do our listeners need to hurry up and swipe up those 14 copies, or will more be put in their place?
I would think so. When I look at, I've never seen a number of how many left, but I would imagine so, because it's been selling well. And
Okay.
it also, they can order it directly from Lee Chapel. Byron Fadley is the co-manager that's in charge of books, and he would be happy to process an order and mail it to someone.
I think when they go to Lee Chapel to order your book, they should order a copy of my book, The Christian Testimony of General Robert E. Lee, as well, because I think that they still have a few copies in stock.
Yes, and when I was in charge, that's how you and I met, is that you sent me the book and you would autograph it for us and send it up, and I so appreciated that. And as far as I know, I'm not over at Washington and Lee very much anymore, but I think you're right. I think they do have some copies of it too.
Yeah.
And when I was there, and I think Byron has done this, we had a little section on Robert E. the religious life of Robert E. Lee. David Cox has written a new book on that. And then for somebody that doesn't want a great big book like David Cox's book, there was your book. And there were ones like The Character and Faith of Robert E. Lee. There were all sorts of books that told that side of the general. And I just think a lot of people don't know that, and they also don't realize that after the Civil War in 1865, he rode Traveler over the mountains to what was then Washington College and became president of the school.
And that even was a ministry in and of itself.
Yes, I agree. And there are many quotes of Robert E. Lee saying that he hoped the students, that his primary hope was that they first became Christians, and then I think his next hope was that after the war that the education there would provide them with the training to have a job that would help support their family and rebuild the nation after the war.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Washington and Lee, at the time when it was Washington College, when Lee became the president, was a Presbyterian college. Am I correct in that?
Well, no, technically it was no longer a Presbyterian. When it was founded, it was Presbyterian ministers that usually became the president, is my understanding. I'm not a historian, but that's my understanding. And so Robert E. Lee, I think, was the first non-Presbyterian president, and in fact, somebody said he's Episcopalian, and I think they said it's not like Sewanee. Sewanee is, I think, isn't it an Episcopal school with an affiliation? But Washington College was primarily Presbyterian, but I don't think it had. I don't think it was known as a Presbyterian school, but I could be wrong. Someone like Taylor Sanders was one of the professors in the history department, and that would be his area. He could tell you right away.
Okay, well, I know here a moment ago when you were talking about how for a time your book was pulled from the shelves at the university and then it was put back. You were being overly gracious in your description of that incident, I think. As I understand it, wasn't the professor who made a target of your book, wasn't that a very politically motivated, call it an attack on their part?
It probably was. I was not there, and so everything I heard was secondhand. And I don't even know the professor, and I had never met her. I'd never had any contact. So I just was very surprised by the whole thing. But I think a lot of the schools there are so many on the faculty that I don't know if rewriting history is the right way, but they really they don't want to see anything written, especially about Confederate generals, that's favorable. And Robert E. Lee really loved Traveler. My story was the subset of his life, and it was on the horse and the owner relationship. It was, I tried to keep it so that, like I said, children would hopefully take this and do some research. And I think maybe when she saw that his name was Jeff Davis, she just went, oh, this is terrible. I don't think she knew enough about the history of Lee and especially of Traveler to realize, as one person wrote me, said, this is a well-established story. This is history. You didn't make up that the horse was named Jeff Davis. And I even wonder if the lady knew that at that time that Jefferson Davis was a well-known American Democratic politician. This is in the glossary in my book, he was a member of the United States Congress from Mississippi, the United States Secretary of War from 1853 to 1857, and from 1861 to 1865, President of the Confederacy. Everybody associates him with the Civil War. They don't seem to realize that he had a life before then. And it's the same with Lee. They don't seem to acknowledge his life before or after, and everything he did at Washington College. I mean, the school was failing when he went there. According to what I've read, there were only about 40 students. It had really become like I don't know if it's kind of like a high school. It was not even hardly a college because there were just no young men to go to school. Everybody was out fighting the war.
So from what I read was the first year that he was there, they had their classrooms under trees because they didn't have any buildings. And he literally arrived by faith because the money wasn't in the treasury to pay his salary. So he showed up with the promise of a very small salary and no promise that they actually had the money to pay it.
I think that's pretty much true, that they really did not have much money to pay him, and it was going to be a very small salary. But the story that I heard was that his daughter, Mary Lee, who was named after her mother, was heard saying, my father is offered all sorts of jobs, but he wants to do one, I think, to support his family, something that would be worthwhile. I can't remember the direct quote now, but somebody evidently from Washington College either heard this or was told this, and so they sent Judge Brockenborough from Lexington over in a borrowed suit and a borrowed horse over to Derwent Cottage, which was outside Richmond, where the Lees had retired after the war, a very rural area. He showed up there and said, you've been elected president of Washington College. And I'm sure General Lee probably went, well, that's interesting, first thing I know about it. But he decided that because, and I really think that's also why I think that this was not more a non-denominational college, because I think he had turned down not only jobs to be like president of some type of insurance company where they told him, we just want your name. And I think he had turned down, it might be Sewanee, but I'm not positive on that, coming to another school to be president. But he selected Washington College. And where I think everybody that works there, or, well, that worked in Lee Chapel, was very thankful that he came. So, it went from 40 students. I've never, see, this is the type of thing I would find when I worked at Lee Chapel, people would bring me in all these just wonderful little stories. I had not heard about the students underneath the trees because Robert E. Lee planted a lot of those trees when he was president, actually. But there was, the basic part of the colonnade was still standing after the war. It wasn't like VMI. Hunter's raid in June of, I think it was 1864, General Hunter came down the valley, and when he got to Lexington, the folklore is that he looked at the campus of Washington College, and he said, we're gonna burn this down, along with he would burn VMI down. And somebody, one of the staff came out, running out, and said, "Oh, but that up there on the colonnade on the top of the building, that's the statue of Washington. This is Washington College. You don't want to burn it down." And so they did ransack the buildings, and they did. Some of the books were taken, of course, from the library, but our buildings were not burned. VMI, it suffered much more greatly than we did because it was a military institute. So, but they could have been, right now, the students, when the weather, of course not right now, it's wintertime, but in the spring and early fall, you do see students even now having class out on the lawn, underneath the trees. And in fact, the United Daughters of the Confederacies, their lecture that's going to be given, I think it's on Friday the 18th in Richmond, is on Robert E. Lee and his landscape design and plan for Washington College. Just another aspect of this man who was an engineer and he really saw the future with the type of changing the school from being like a Greek and Latin type school to one that's had more the type of majors where you then go out and are able to apply it to making a living. So it really, I just think he needs to be given more credit for all the different things he did. And he was in charge of West Point. He was the superintendent of West Point before the Civil War. So he did have, educational administration experience.
Right. Well, I know you've retired from the university.
That's right.
And I know that your replacement there is the manager at the Lee Chapel. Has told me that he's felt pressure, if you will.
Uh-huh.
Apparently, the university is getting away from the whole image of both Washington and Lee, but particularly Lee. You would think if somebody was not an admirer of Robert E. Lee, you would think that they would just send their resume to a different school, but apparently that's not the case.
Yeah, I know.
And so the university seems to be getting away from its Confederate heritage and from the legacy of your namesake. Yeah. And so as more people like yourself, of course, you were in a position where you could retire.
Right.
Your replacement is a much younger man, and he does not have that luxury. And so who's going to hold the line, if anybody there, or is the line just going to be lost in that once great institution?
I hope the line will not be lost. I know that President Dudley, who is there now, is really trying to kind of balance both sides. And I think a lot of the alumni have written him and the Board of Trustees, and I think their voice needs to be heard too. And I agree with you. I hate to see history rewritten, and that's why I wanted to go ahead and get my little book out. And I'm sure you felt that with yours. You need these people. They were not one-dimensional. There were so many different aspects of them, and the Civil War is part of our history, and you just can't railroad it down and try to destroy it.
I am going to cut it right there because we are literally out of time for this week's broadcast. of TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. Be sure to check out our website, www.dixieheritage.net. Sign up for our newsletter. It's absolutely free. And when you do, we'll send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And go to Amazon.com or the Washington and Lee University Lee Chapel bookstore website and check out Margaret's great book, My Colt, The Story of Traveler. Until next week, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless and have a great Lee Jackson weekend.